Hello everybody and welcome back. I'm Christo and once again we are taking a look at Grey Eminence. This time at Dev Diary 3. States, countries, statehood, laws, and how these different things interact and are governed. Without further ado, let's dive straight back into it. So, this is the third Dev Diary. We actually skipped this one to talk about geography a while ago. If you're not familiar with what Grey Eminence is, I have plenty of other videos on that. Do check those out first. There is a playlist which should be linked in the comments of this one. But Grey Eminence is a grand strategy game. That's all you need to know for now. Apart from that, check the other videos and we'll dive straight into countries. So, as we know, we're going 1356 to 1956. And states in this time were A, not always independent, and B, across a whole range of different government forms. And we're going to look at how we can do that. This is something we've mentioned before, but there are composite states, multiple layers of vassals. You can have states within states. Think HRE, think France. These are the kinds of situations where I'm fully expecting to have vassal states within other states. And we'll get some more details on exactly how that works later on. But for now, we're just going to look at how states themselves as individual entities work. So first off, government forms. This is something that in other Paradox games is very binary. Like in Victoria 2 and EU4 and Hoi, for example, you have one government form or you have another, right? And it's very, usually it's quite one-dimensional, what that means usually. In Grey Eminence, it is essentially two-dimensional. You have firstly a source of legitimacy and secondly a distribution of power, and then depending on which of the different combinations of those two things you have, you get a different government form. So sources of legitimacy, meaning like, you know, on what basis do people assess your state's legitimacy? You have dynastic, religious, electoral, and tribal. So these all make sense. I'm not certain, I mean, you know, I could quibble exactly what they're calling things, but I don't know. Electoral doesn't sound quite right to me, but that's purely aesthetic preference on my part. Basically, are you a monarchy? Are you a theocracy? Are you a democracy? Or are you a tribe? Tribal also seems a little, I don't know, I'm not quite sure. It's like in Mayo and Taxes when you have your four estates, right? You have the nobles, the burghers, the clergy, and the tribes. The tribes don't quite fit as their own estate. And I'm not quite sold on how they're working here. We'll see, obviously, how that works later on. Because part of my thinking about this is that tribal and electoral seem similar. I'm sure the mechanics will work differently, but look, when they're describing tribal, a society where kinship and belonging to a particular culture were prioritized more highly than dynastic ties. To me, this describes 20th and 21st, 20th mostly century ethno-nationalism, which some of which were to a certain extent electoral, but I don't know. This kind of, yeah, relating to kinship and belonging to a particular culture, like the process to try and unify Germany, or Italy, for example, would those be tribal? Obviously, I mean, maybe not obviously, but I would assume not. I'm not quite sure how an autocracy works here, because of course we next have the sources of the distribution of power. We have autocratic, oligarchic, and democratic. So I don't know exactly how an electoral, like if you were trying to represent the newly unified Italy, right, you'd be looking at, I guess, probably still maybe oligarchic more than democratic, but then tribal? I don't know, probably not, right? But anyway, let's look in, maybe I'm reading way too much into this and just thinking too hard about like the use of tribe to describe people essentially only if they are not Europeans. But anyway, so monarchies. You have a ruling dynasty comprised of characters in the world that belong to the ruler's current dynasty. Makes perfect sense. This is amazing, by the way. I love that there's this kind of, the CK2 element being brought into EU4. I would say, and this is personal preference, rather dramatically failed in Imperator, but that doesn't mean it's a bad idea. And I'm really happy to see them trying it. I should not trying it again, but like, that idea re-emerging, because they of course weren't the ones that tried it the first time. So you have a royal family which consists of your ruler's parents, grandparents, siblings, children, and its source of legitimacy. But what I don't know is how the legitimacy of this government is determined, right? Because the legitimacy of a dynasty is a very complicated thing. And obviously in EU4, mayo and taxes and stuff, it's relatively simple. In 3.0, it gets a bit more complicated. It's about the support of different elites and things like that. But it's a complicated thing, and it's the kind of thing that can lead to really interesting narrative things, or truly horrendous things to experience if you're in the real world. Like the Wars of the Roses in the UK, just to keep it, familiar to some areas that I actually know about. There was a kind of fundamental breakdown in the ability of any particular ruling dynasty to claim legitimacy, right? And that led to decades of war. And how do you represent that? Is it that each member of the royal family is it based on their relationships with other noble families within a country? Are there really lots of other noble families within a country, or just characters? We'll talk more about characters probably next, I think, actually, after this one, because I think it ties nicely into politics. We have, by the way, a bunch of dev diaries to go through, so look forward to those over the coming probably 2 weeks. I've got a whole bunch of dev diaries that I'm going to record today and then push out to you. But yeah, monarchies, royal family, makes sense. Interesting possibilities about how that's going to work. Next, theocracies, source of legitimacy tied to religion. Makes sense. I have to imagine this means, country's ruler must be a member of the clergy, and that means, I guess, that you will gain or lose legitimacy depending on how much your populace and your clergy, and maybe maybe your nobles, maybe everyone, feels about how religiously proper you're being, I guess, partly, but we'll see. And unique mechanics, which will be cool, for the religious denominations. We'll also look at those later. Rulers of a country with an electoral source of legitimacy derive their authority solely through the outcome of an election, which can take various forms. And yes, these elections needn't be public, which obviously makes sense. Almost, depending on what you mean by public elections didn't start till 1940 or something. The vast majority of elections were restricted to a few elites, both in terms of candidacy and participation. So that's going to be really interesting. The idea that you can really have a electoral system. Like, let's say you started as Poland. I don't think Poland was an electoral monarchy in 1356, but they were, as we all know from EU4, or as many of us know from EU4, they were eventually a kind of democracy in that the nobles could vote on who the next king was, or certain ones of the nobles. I don't know the very specifics, but trying to move slowly from that in gradual steps from 100 nobles can vote to universal suffrage. That's really cool. Like, that's a long-term narrative that you could choose to try and have play out. Or you could try and, get to 1956 with 150 people allowed to vote in your country. That would be another cool narrative that you'd be able to play out. And the way that this game seems to be saying that it's going to allow those amazing narratives to be real and impactful and meaningful and let you play them out, safe to say I'm excited, dear viewer. And the final source of legitimacy is tribal. So I don't quite understand how this works. This category is perhaps the most fluid, since it tries to represent countries from radically different walks of life. So they recognize the problem, which, as I would expect them to. Nevertheless, we're departing from other grand statutory times and not artificially handicapping tribal countries simply due to them being tribal. Very cool and based. This idea of tribal equaling primitive permeates popular consciousness despite significant efforts from historiographers. I'm thinking of Historiograph, a rather excellent YouTube channel, to stamp it out. So they're doing their part to dispel it, which will be cool because the idea of keeping a tribal government form, but adopting, for example, maybe a democratic distribution of power and modernized other areas of that, because typically you'd think of modernizing as moving away from tribal, right? But the idea of being able to keep that and modernizing other aspects of the state, but retaining that kind of core identity, if you were playing as the Iroquois or something, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing wrong. Iroquois? It's a French word, I think, which is kind of weird when you think about it, but I think it's a French word, so Iroquois. Anyway, so the next set, so that's right, you understand, we've got two axes, right? We've got legitimacy and distribution of power. So we've understood legitimacy. Now let's look at distribution of power. This parameter tells us who in a country's power holders should be. And I say should because the reality of a country's power distribution might diverge significantly from what the law says it should be, which is interesting, right? So you could have a democratic one, but actually some people are rich enough to make it effectively an oligarchy, which, topical, could be interesting in terms of how you get that. Under the autocratic power distribution, a country's ruler is the sole legal authority. So this makes perfect sense, right? If you're an autocrat and the character rules, then potentially, the ruler rules. But if you get a ruler, then you're going to be able to potentially make great strides. You're going to be able to do cool stuff. But also, they could be terrible, and then they could make a huge pile of problem, which would be great. Also, the idea that you could prefer going through civil wars and usurpations and stuff is interesting. I like this fact that we, as far as I can tell, in Grey Eminence, we are very much the spirit of the state. We're not the dynasty. We're not the ruler. This is a kind of Victoria 2 energy that I'm getting off it, right? So in Victoria 2, in CK2, if your dynasty gets totally overthrown, you lose. If in Victoria 2, if the communists rise up and overthrow your fascist dictatorship, you don't lose, you just become communist. So because you're playing as the state, which is cool, and I like that. I like that version of things. Autocratic, this means that one of the country's elites acts as a counterweight to the ruler. Interesting, usually as an assembly, council, or parliament. So that's interesting. So you could have an autocratic clergy. Sorry, not autocratic, oligarchic clergy, or an oligarchic noble, or an oligarchic burgher kind of situation, where it doesn't have to be a particular elite. Whereas, historically in PDX games, when we talk about oligarchies, we just mean burghers, basically. That's cool. Exact structure varies. Its membership isn't necessarily limited to characters from the oligarchic elite. So you can imagine an oligarchy like an elected oligarchy like the UK in 1800 that transitioned to an elected democracy like the UK now, which is really cool. The idea that you could see this natural shift from oligarchy to democratic as a particular parliament gained more and more characters from a different elite, or characters that had different motivations within the original elite. It's cool stuff. It's cool stuff. So the final one is democratic. Okay, this makes sense. Giving political power to at least some part of the population, closely linked to the rise of constitutionalism and political parties. However, while enfranchising the people might appease their hunger for representation, one can never satisfy everyone. Thus, once representation cat is out of the bag, you'll find there's always someone unhappy enough with the status quo to meddle with your plans. Yes, as we saw it very much, in history, and this is speaking in incredibly broad strokes as someone who's not a historian, granting representation to people did turn out to be a very slippery slope. Of course, I'm quite happy to be at the bottom of that particular slide, but you can see what they're talking about in terms of once the cat is out of the bag. And, okay, they lied. There were only 3 distributions of power. We actually have a 4th. Anarchic. This one alters gameplay so much we need a full-length dev diary. So we don't know anything about that yet. But here we go. So we have dynastic, religious, electoral, and tribal as our x-axis. And anarchic, autocratic, oligarchic. And then you have the different possible elites that can be oligarchic. And democratic, which gives us all of these different possible ones. And they haven't told us about... No, sorry. These ones, of course, don't exist because they're just these ones. But we don't know how anarchic works. I mean, I have no idea how you would be the spirit of a state in an anarchy situation, because, no state, right? I'm not sure how that's going to work, but I look forward to hearing more. So yeah, I'm not going to read you all of these, but you can see the kind of things you'd expect, right? So a nobility that is dynastic and oligarchic would be an aristocratic monarchy. So that's how I think these two, aristocratic monarchy and absolute monarchy, represent a lot of the European nations in 1356. But of course, you've also got, plutocratic situations. There's some plutocratic monarchies and plutocratic republics with the merchants in control. You also, really cool to see that the military are represented here as their own elite. Typically, those have been very bound up in the nobility in previous titles. When I say previous titles, I mean other titles. But yeah, I like that. I think that's very cool. The idea you could be a statocratic theocracy. So I'm thinking Teutons, basically, I guess. That's really cool. I mean, of course, they're also kind of a theocracy, so it'll be interesting how that works out. But yeah, and then democratic, of course, you have constitutional monarchies, constitutional theocracies, and constitutional republics, and tribal republics. And yes, again, the tribes being able to have all of this different stuff, like a theocratic chiefdom, very cool. Next, laws. So we're not going to go super deep into this because they only give us a couple of examples of the laws anyway. But they do tell us that there are just over 30 laws for most countries in 1356, but you get more from tech, and most laws have options. There's a huge variety of laws, and as the game goes on, there's going to be more and more laws as more and more tech unlocks. So let's take a brief look at tenancy. As you can see, there's 4 options on tenancy, right? Serfdom, peasantry, free tenancy, and abolished. And if you want to relate this to Mayo and Taxa 3.0, some of these are kind of like privileges or rights that your elites have. And so they do somewhat similar things in that they some states like it when you're one way and the other. So this, for example, this gives you favors with the nobles. Some people don't like it. If you have peasantry, then there's some peasantry discontent. This all makes sense. I'm not going to worry about numbers or design on tooltips and things like that. It's too early days for me to critique that kind of stuff. I'd need to have my hands on a beta before I was saying like this seems a little simplistic, or I'd rather have icons or any of that. I'm just gonna wait on that. Basically, in case you're wondering, what Christo, you're the arch complainer. How can you not be complaining that the plus 30 is not green? But yeah, we'll leave that for now. So we're not going to go too super deep here. If you want, obviously, the link to this dev diary is in the comments, and you can go and check it out yourself if you want to read through it all. But the idea, they have all these different laws which can, obviously, let's say you got here. Let's do the maths. Let me do the maths. So I haven't done this kind of maths in a while, but you've got 30 laws to start with, an average of 3 different options per law. That's 27,000 possible combinations. So we said earlier that there's, a grid of 4 by whatever it was, 8 in terms of different government forms. Not quite true. There's actually 27,000 different types of laws you can have, combinations of laws you can have. So you really can build a very unique government. Of course, some of these laws, I have to imagine, you're moving from worse to better in certain situations, but it's never that simple. Better for whom? And so yeah, a truly vast set of potential combinations. It could also be that certain laws can only go with certain other things and all of that, but hey ho. So yeah, we're not going to look at the specifics of what these laws mean, but this one is interesting. That what means even, but this one is interesting. So on religion laws, there is an investiture law, and you can either have head of faith, local clergy, local laity, and state. This is more choices than we've previously got in lots of Paradox games, with the idea of do you have investiture or not in CK2 is kind of, this is that fleshed out more. It's really interesting. So the idea that you can have the head of the faith be the one appointing people, clergy, or you can have the state. And the state obviously is probably going to empower the state, but might annoy the existing clergy, or might even annoy, other people's religious powers beyond your country. And yes, simony, you can do simony, which is selling offices, which would be cool. So good source of income for the state, potentially, if you go all Henry VIII on their ass. And then, of course, there are a whole set of slavery laws, which I wanted to talk about. So I can't remember if we've mentioned this before. Grey Eminence obviously does feature slavery, and you can have slave soldiers and slave officers, which makes them less discontent, which seems odd to me. But we can, again, I'm not going to comment too much on that because we'll see when we get closer to the game. But also, this is a really interesting tooltip to me. Plus or minus up to 10 favors with all elites based on their opinion of slavery, which means that each elite has an opinion about various different political issues, slavery being one of them. And that is fascinating because that presumably is somewhat informed, or maybe entirely informed, by each of the individuals in that elite, which means if you get an elite that starts swaying against slavery, you're going to have an elite that's clamoring for you to, for example, go to freedom of the womb, which I have to imagine you are always born free. You can be a slave, but you are born free. Or you have people in a particular elite who are going to be getting really mad because they want you to be allowing slavery and things like that. It's all these dynamics with the elites. Very cool. Very cool. I'm not going to look at modability because it's not my area, but it is pretty cool that they have, and this is not what the map looks like in-game, to be clear. This is the editor. But yeah, if you want to restore the Roman Empire really easily, you just paint it, which is pretty cool. Like this degree of modability, so people can create their own worlds and stuff. Very, very cool. And that, in a nutshell, is the Dev Diary. Do go and check it out yourself. I will see you all in the next one. There should be a link in the description. There should also be a playlist link in the description for this playlist of the other Dev Diaries that I've taken a look at. You can expect more of these coming soon. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.